I know this is extremely hard to see. Basically, with time passing, trees have grown. The houses in front of me are probably from the Civil War period. They weren't here. This was a plowed hill. It was a hill you could see for miles on either end. You could see your line forming, just like what's in back of me. I could see for about half to almost a mile in this farmland. That's how it was here. But this is what the gunners would have seen. They would have seen the trees on the opposite end of the Brandywine. You can still see them. And they would have seen the British amassing over there because they had red uniforms. Now these red uniforms stuck out. We really were, in 1777, our soldiers, our Pennsylvania soldiers, had blue and red uniforms, the typical one, but they weren't really clothed very well. They had what they had from home. So basically, if they had green or they had cloth, they looked a little different than the British. The British were very meticulous people. They wore red uniforms. They looked the part. They had hats, tricorner hats. They looked out of place in this landscape. You would have seen them. See where that power pole is? That's on our side of the Brandywine. I can see that. On the other side of the Brandywine are those trees. Now, most likely those trees were probably there. They might not have been. But when you fire from an area like on our right-hand side from Proctor's Battery, you're going to get a lot of smoke, you're going to get noise, and you're going to know where your cannons are. The British knew exactly where this redoubt was, and they fired on this redoubt, and one man died right here. A man was killed here. Now, these guns were 4 to 6 pounds. Now, there is speculation that they could have used an 8-pounder here. A gentleman that I know has a cannonball that he said was from this battle. He found it in a barn that was torn down in 1905. He found this cannonball inside the beam. How true that is, I don't know. But the cannonball weighed out at 8 pounds. Now, from every aspects of this battle that I've researched, I don't know if they've had 8-pounders during that time. I don't know if that was a French piece. I don't know if it was an American piece that fired 8 pounds. It could be just a cockamamie story, I don't know. But anyway, the cannonball does exist. They said it was from here, and it's in private hands right now. Now, the cannons here would have been bronze, and they would have been the Hessian cannon. Now, when they went into Trenton during the Christmas Eve night and went across the Delaware, they surprised the Hessian soldiers, killed them, took their weapons, and also took their cannons. Those cannons were taken to a foundry. They were 4-pound cannons. They were smaller. Washington had them bored out to 6 pounds. Those cannons were on top of this hill. And also, I don't know if the Americans at the time had mortars. Mortars were a little harder to come by. The British had mortars. Mortars were stationed across the Brandywine also on the British side. Now, what a mortar did wasn't fire a projectile in an arc. It fired a projectile into the air and down on the enemy. And if they were lucky, the projectile was hollow, it had gunpowder inside, and it had balls inside, most likely. Shrapnel. It wasn't invented yet, but I'm sure that they put something inside this cannonball. Most likely it was just black powder during that time. And it had a fuse. So when that fired into the air, into this direction, hopefully, across the Brandywine, these shells would explode. They would break open, and shrapnel would fly in different directions, hopefully killing people. They had those over across the Brandywine, the British had. Now, our cannonballs were different. We had 2 types of shot during the Battle of Brandywine. We had solid shot. Now, that's exactly what it is. It's solid. It's a solid piece of metal. These were usually made locally. They went to Reading to get there. There was a foundry in Reading. There was Warwick furnaces. There's different iron factories that made cannonballs for the Continental cause. And let me tell you something, if the British found out where we got our arms and ammunition from, they just burned them to the ground. So basically, when they were doing some excavation at Valley Forge, the forge itself, they found that there was charness and there was some cannonballs there. So they were definitely producing arms for the Revolutionary War cause. So here we are on top of the redoubt, on the line of defense of the Pennsylvanians, probably where I'm standing. Washington would have been up here directing his cannons to move left or right, where to fire. And, you know, like I said before, there was 2 types of shot. The solid we went over. And then they used something called canister shot. Canister shot was just as it says. It was a piece of wood on either end, and it was a tightly wound bundle of iron balls. Now, these iron balls measured from about a half an inch to an inch long, an inch wide in diameter, and there'd be about 20 to 30 of them inside of a compressed cylinder. Now, they would put these down the barrel of the gun. So as you know, if you guys hunt, that if you use a shotgun, you can kill something better, and you really don't have to aim. It was the same with these big guns on top of this hill. I don't know if they used canister on top of this hill, but it was available. Now, the guns on top of this hill have a little bit of history about them. These guns were taken. They weren't brought with the Army. These guns did not survive. There was probably 8 guns on top of this hill, considering how big this redoubt was we just looked at. And also, they brought probably 2 guns up to Birmingham from this area. So they were left with probably 4 guns in this area, probably 4 and 6 pounders. Okay? When the British did move on this army, they heard, the Pennsylvanians down here heard commotion. They heard commotion up to the west. They heard gunshots. They heard cannonade. They heard musketry. They knew that something was going on. And Washington, like I said, had conflicting reports whether or not there was a flanking maneuver. He didn't know. But by then, it was late in the day. These cannons right here, they were playing with the British. They were firing. The British was firing at them. They were firing back and forth at each other for about 4 hours. That's a long time to be firing these guns. So around 12 o'clock in the afternoon, when the British Army was all over the Brandywine, they stopped firing for a while. They took a break. But when they heard starting to fire late in the day, probably around 4 o'clock, they started to hear some cannons going off. Washington knew, hey, we better send some more people. I think there's going to be an outflanking maneuver. But he did finally find out there was a flanking maneuver, and he took Pennsylvanians, and he also took his reserves in the back up to Birmingham Township. Now, that's where I'm standing right now. It looks exactly like it probably would have done. Not too much has changed here, just with the trees. And when you look at where do I go? If I'm standing here and I'm a Pennsylvania soldier and my commander tells me to go to Birmingham Meeting House, I can just hear in the distance where it is. I don't know where it is. So basically, a lot of these guys had to go through these woods. There was no cart paths. There was a couple roads here. There wasn't a lot of roads that went up to Birmingham Meeting House. They had to physically run through the woods. And that's where you hear these heroic charges, where they got up to Birmingham Meeting House from this area where I'm standing, about 1.5 miles away in 45 minutes. That's incredible. These guys must have been running. They're pulling their wagons. They're getting ammunition. They're running with the cannons. They have to pull the cannons up most of these hills. But what's incredible about the position, this cannon position, it was taken by the British. When they finally charged across that river, they knew that something was going on up north. And that was the signal that Hal said. Hal said to them, when I start firing from my flanking maneuver to the commander across the river, that means charge across. Let's go. Let's go. Let's go get these Continentals that are all stationed along this line. And they did. They charged across the Brandywine. They had their rifles above their heads. They had their Carker boxes on top of their head. They waded through the Brandywine, and you can just imagine all these guys coming across the Brandywine. You got a line here. Now, will that line hold? Most of your reinforcements are gone. They've gone to Birmingham, and a lot of your Pennsylvanians and a lot of the militia were a little further. The militia didn't get really too much involved. Now, they're all going up to Birmingham, so no, this area was kind of protected just a little bit, but further up west wasn't. Now, the British knew this. The British saw and heard the same thing we did. They heard the cannonade. They heard the musketry up there. They knew that something was going on at Birmingham, and they also were informed that Howe is flanking. They knew that Howe was going to flank the army. They saw the American line break about 1/4 mile to my west. The American line retreated. General Sullivan and Sterling's divisions that were stationed about a 1/2 mile to my west on this ridge had broke. They broke and they went to Birmingham. They met Howe's force up there. Now, what that did, that gave the redcoats on this side an easy opportunity to come in and outflank the left of this line where I'm staring right now.